Good morning, everyone, wherever you are. I have the gift of being in Los Angeles, which I saw the temperatures, and when my client asked me to stay out here, I was like, you betcha, no problem. And I know my guest is back in North Carolina, which was really fun. We've been having a lot of great Duke conversation. So by way of introduction, if you haven't met me before, I'm Ashley Koff, registered dietitian and the CEO founder of the Better Nutrition Program. If you haven't checked out our tools, they are developed for practitioners and patients to be able to assess your current nutrition so that you can figure out what is already better. Why change something if it's already better, but also what we might need to tune up and how we can tune that up. And I also run these interviews twice a week because my belief is that one of the best tools or better tools that we can have is actually talking to people who are experts in different areas on their topics. And that's because, there's a lot of information out there today, science information or marketing information. But the people that you really want to learn for how to actually do things are the people who have been helping people actually make their better choices, how they assess it, what those recommendations are. So today I have the awesome privilege of having Anna Lutz join me. And Anna has you'll see it in two different places. She has Lutz and Alexander, which we have the website up here. And she also has this great free guide for all of you, whether you're a practitioner, parent, teacher. Please check out that guide, and that's in the information. But also she has Sunny Side Up Nutritionist. So you'll see in some places we've got the two different ones promoted, and you can find her in both spaces on all sorts of different social media. So Anna, I thought we would jump in today. You can talk, thank you first of all for joining. But I always love to understand, when I first, I do that pre-interview and ask some information, how did you get into you're working in two very, interesting areas, feeding families, kids, and then also eating disorders. So I'd love for you to walk us through kind of how you became a practitioner and hyper-focused in these areas.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Ashley. I'm thrilled to talk to you. I'm one of the rare dietitians that actually went into nutrition because of my interest in eating disorders. I went to Duke, as we've just mentioned, and as an undergraduate, I became really interested in why people eat the way they eat. I came from a family that had pretty typical eating patterns, and I was on this college campus and noticing how people ate very differently for the first time, hearing a lot about dieting. And so I studied psychology with a focus on eating behaviors, and then decided to be a dietitian and specialize in eating disorders. And through that work, I've really become passionate about how adults talk to kids about nutrition. I don't at all believe parents cause eating disorders, but I do believe our environment in general has an influence on how kids think about their bodies and about food. And so I'm really, really passionate about trying to combat our diet culture that unfortunately our children are really getting hit hard by in their schools and with other, just their environment everywhere they go.
Yeah. So I'd love to start there. And just a reminder to anyone, if you have a question, a burning question, please ask it here. If you are not live with us and you're watching this at a better time for you, both Anna and I are available to answer your questions. So go ahead.
Our environment in general has an influence on how kids think about their bodies and about food.
We're just a little technical stuff. No worries on that part today on my end. You may see the lights go out. We're on a timer here. It's a very eco-friendly office. I'll just turn them back on. I always exist in the better, not perfect space. So we should get it all sorted. So if you have any questions, go ahead and ask that. So Anna, years ago, actually before becoming a dietitian, because I started out my career in, here's the mea culpa, in advertising, selling sugared cereals to America on behalf of Kellogg's and telling people how good it was for them. And so I knew just, the impressions, the millions and millions of messages. I did sort of move into a space of doing things better, and that was working for the Kaiser Family Foundation. And at the time, we learned, and it was really around talking to kids about sexual health and how do you, when do you start? And so at the time, it was like, hey, you need to talk to them between like 6 and 8. I joke now that we have to talk to like in utero, we have to start talking about, Facebook and all these other things, right? Hi, Facebook, we're here. But, so I think one of the challenges that people will present is how do you actually compete for that, against all of that messaging that kids are getting from such a young age, even in their schools, their preschools, even as you're leaving the hospital, there's messaging about, what you should and shouldn't feed. So what's your advice for parents to really try to position themselves in that space as not just so much an authority, but how can you actually have your communication break through?
Well, I think the biggest thing that parents can do is model. I'm really a big advocate of that our actions really are what's going to sink in over the years. They're going to hear all this talk everywhere they go, but if they see their parents sitting down for meals, prioritizing food in some way, saying it's snack time, let's sit down and have a snack, having a great variety of different kinds of foods, not talking negatively about their own bodies, and really kind of focusing on what bodies do rather than what bodies look like. I feel like that modeling really makes a difference. And, when I have 3 children, and when my youngest started coming home from preschool with these more diet-based messages, I just would become beside myself because of my work with people with eating disorders. But I really have, through the years, she's 12 now, I really do see that the messages she gets at home really speak a lot louder than these kind of more soundbite messages that she gets from other sources.
I love that. One of the things that you said, I think it's a great one for parents to keep in mind. And again, we're talking about teachers, practitioners. We're going to get into those areas as well. But it's the show versus the tell. And I love that. That's awesome. So when I started writing the promo for this, and when we were talking about it, it's like age-appropriate feeding or age-appropriate eating. And I think there's a lot of questions that we have today about the difference between age and life stage. So when you're talking about age-appropriate eating, help me understand, because I think sometimes people, some of the eating and the recommendations are like between 0 and 6 months. But just like we know, like no 40-year-old woman is exactly the same, we also know that no 0 to 6 month child or 10-year-old or whatever is exactly the same. So how do you define that appropriateness based on life stage age?
That's a great question. When I talk about age-appropriate nutrition, I'm really thinking about how the words we use with our kids. And if we want, we can go back to the actual feeding part. But we know that young children are concrete thinkers. And so up until about middle school age, developmentally, young minds really take things very, very concretely. And I agree with you. There could be a 6th grader that is amazing at abstract thinking, and there could be a 6th grader that is very concrete. So it's different for every individual child. But in general, it really is around that 12, 13-year-old time that developmentally a brain becomes able to think more abstractly. And the thing about nutrition is it's really abstract. You can't see calcium. You can't, things like moderation or a little are all abstract things. They're not concrete. And so when we teach a 5-year-old, don't eat cake because it's bad, they're going to take that very concretely. Where you and I know we can go to a birthday party and enjoy cake. The world's not going to stop moving. It's a part of our what we do. It's a part of good nutrition. But young children take it very, very literally, and that's what I see in my practice is sometimes kids taking very well-intended nutrition information very concretely, and then it affects their health. They're scared to touch dietary fats, or they're scared to touch anything with sugar in it, where the intention was, of course, a good intention, but it turns out not so good.
So let's talk about that, because I think, when we think about that notion, I didn't know that. So, first of all, thank you to understand that difference between concrete and abstract. So let's dive in a little bit deeper in terms of what concrete thinking means, and then how you can maybe talk a little bit about the difference between the way that you would communicate something around making your food choices to a child that is in a concrete thinking stage versus one that's able to start thinking more abstractly.
That's a great. So I think your first part of the question is what's the difference? Is that? Yep. So a concrete thinker is really going to focus on what going to think in a black and white way. So is apple a fruit? It's very, very concrete. But again, nutrition is not concrete. When I think of ice cream, ice cream, we could say it's in the dairy category. We could say it's in the dessert category. You're going to hear that it's really good for your bones. You're going to hear that it's high in sugar. And so again, I think of a kindergartner that it's too abstract. It's not, they cannot put it in one bucket or another. And to make sense of it, some more sensitive children will try to put it in one bucket or the other and become really, really focused on it. Some children, if it doesn't make sense, it'll just kind of roll off their back and it doesn't really affect them. An abstract thinker is able to understand you can put different things in more than one category. Something is not all good or all bad. You can enjoy it in different ways. And so that's kind of the biggest thing I think is important for anyone to understand when we talk about nutrition to kids is what is the difference. And then with young kids, with feeding, we really talk about that the way they learn about nutrition is through modeling, like I said before. So you're feeding them fruits and vegetables and whole grains and protein all throughout the day. That's what they're going to learn. Those are the foods to eat because that's what you're offering them at meals and snacks and different times. You don't need to say cake is a treat or cake is not good for you because they don't see it on their plate 6 times a day.
Yeah. I love that. Okay, and so I listed out, we're going to get to some of these in terms of like the better age-appropriate messages and how we would talk about them in the concrete and the abstract, because I love this. I think lexicon and nutrition and how we communicate is so important. So I wanted to actually start off with the word treat, because that is actually the whole notion of what is a treat or when do we have a treat. I've had people say to me that really is actually like a setup for good and bad foods, and at younger ages, they're not understanding. So talk to me a little bit about, is treat a bad word? Or, especially in those concrete ages, and does treat, the notion of treat actually set up a, problem with foods later? So I'm just still doing my on and off.
Yeah, I don't like the word treat.
Okay.
I'm never going to tell a parent, don't do this, because I feel like every parent is different, every family's different, but I personally don't like that because I think it's a euphemism for something good and something bad. It also inherently has kind of a reward part of it. Like you've done something, so you get a treat. I think that's inherent in that word. And so I think of it more as just, like we'll call things dessert. That feels very kind of, some things are dessert and some things aren't. But I don't like the word, treat. I don't like tying food to any kind of reward because it really can become confusing when we say, well, you've done something good, so you get a treat. I think separating those things. I think it's fine to get a reward, but I like to keep food out of it. Yeah.
So let's also talk about, one of the things that a lot of parents will communicate with me is, so maybe they're in a space where they're learning about this and they're in the show, they're really focused on, hey, here's what I'm feeding you. But now maybe you're going back to work, and so your child's either with a nanny or they're at a daycare, or grandma is spending a lot of time with them. And then certainly as they're going into different groups, they're encountering other adults that are then, sort of speaking on that part. So what are some guidelines or tools that you might use to engage other people that are going to have a formidable amount of time where they're in the show and tell opportunity with your child to sort of keep that messaging? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is the thing that I've had to kind of personally as a parent pick my battles because it's not going to be perfect. But I do. So my children, they've been in all of those situations. I've had children in daycare situations. I've had them in preschool situations and with grandma. So we've done it all. With family members, I have asked them to read Ellen Satter's book, which a lot of what I'm talking about is based in the division of responsibility. And so Ellen Satter is kind of on the forefront of this work where parents have jobs, which is to decide when and what. And the other part of the division of the responsibility is the children's jobs is to decide if and how much. So it's snack time. We're having apples and peanut butter. The parent decided what time it is and what we're having, and then let the child decide what they're going to eat from what's offered and how much. And so with family members, we can say, would you read this book? This is how we're doing it at home. They may or may not agree with it, but at least you can have that conversation. With child care centers, I have said up front, this is my philosophy. You know, I made that one-page thing because I get asked by parents all the time, so that's why I made that handout. Ellen Satter has some resources, but I might just kind of do a preliminary. You know, we don't talk about good food, bad foods in my house, but it's, you know, it's saturated in our culture, so there's lots of times that they get those messages, and I'll just follow up with an email, or I'll follow up with a face-to-face conversation and try to explain why it worries me that we're giving our children those messages, and then in the long run realize it's not going to be perfect. Just this week, my 3-year-old came home from preschool and was taught by a dentist came to her classroom and taught her what healthy and unhealthy foods were, and she used those 2 words. And it just breaks my heart because a 3-year-old doesn't shop. She's saying what she's getting at her meals. And she just, there's the black and white that we're teaching at age 3. So it's something that happens a lot.
So it's a perfect segue because, of course, that dentist is extremely well-intentioned. Probably if they're coming into a school, like, has a child in that school, you know, that kind of a thing. So healthcare practitioners. So let's talk directly. You know, a lot of people who are connecting with us here, and we have the Better Nutrition Provider Group. So I've got people who will be watching this later, where it's part of our continuing education with practitioners. And I've had some of the worst messaging situations, certainly with adults, but definitely with kids, where, you know, I had a child say to me, like, you know, in tears, coming to see me as the dietitian, say, you know, the nurse told me I was fat, and she's like, and the nurse is, you know, is obese. So, like, just mixed messaging, you know, on that part. And so, whether it's from a teacher perspective or a healthcare practitioner, one of the things I think that's really tough in the messaging is the difference between weight and health. So what are some of the tips for a healthcare practitioner and also for a parent engaging with a healthcare practitioner to try to have this communication be both age appropriate and also focused on the health as opposed to on just the weight piece, which, as you've said, is really what can lead us to problem areas?
Great. I love that question. So I am a Health at Every Size practitioner, so which means I subscribe to the Health at Every Size principles, which is a focus on health, not weight. And so going back to even terminology, you know, that words like overweight and obese are really stigmatizing because they're kind of based on this very arbitrary medical model with cutoffs of BMI. And so I really talk to my clients, and when I work with professionals and other practitioners, about we need to be first practicing evidence-based practice, and the evidence really does not tie weight to health outcomes. When you look at the research, a lot of it is about weight cycling. When people are on extreme diets and lose a lot of weight and gain a lot of weight, that really causes a lot of the the health concerns that we are tying to weight. And so, you know, that as practitioners, we can be part of that problem. So I really talk about, let's focus on behaviors. You know, let's focus on what kind of behaviors you're doing. And weight is just outside of that. Weight might change up or down, we don't know, but what are the behaviors? And again, the research really backs up if we focus on feeding ourselves regularly, a variety of foods, moving, that health outcomes improve outside of weight. And so I try to educate practitioners about that kind of nugget. A question I love to tell parents or anyone to ask their practitioner, and this comes from the Health at Every Size movement, is to ask your practitioner, if I was what you would call a typical weight person, and I had this health problem, what would you be telling that person? Because a lot of times, because of weight stigma, the practitioner can only see weight, and they're saying, well, you need to lose weight. And we know that that's not, we don't have a solution for that right now. A lot of times it leads to weight cycling. But if they can say, okay, I have a knee problem. If I was in a, quote, typical weight body, what would be your recommendation for me to try to cut through that weight stigma?
Yeah. I think that's so important. Yeah, 100%. I mean, I had a client whose baby was very large. And her doctor said, we've got a real issue. Your baby, weight-wise and used BMI, which, as we know, is like the worst tool. One of the reasons my entire company exists, And he said, we really have to look at, what are you feeding this child? And she said, so he's exclusively breastfed. And so I literally was, and in that practitioner, and this again, you guys, is not to pick on practitioners. I think one of the challenges in that part, I think the other part is some of the communication around digestive health. So we know, especially at young ages, that if, first of all, we know, especially girls are meant to have bellies, and all these things, but their digestion may be the root cause as opposed to, what they're eating. And so I think it's really about, asking those questions, so vitally important on that part. I think one of the other pieces that a lot of parents struggle with, and I love this notion now, I'm going to totally focus on the concrete versus the abstract. One of the things that is a challenge is when there's diversity. Now, there might be diversity because a child can't eat something. If it's a free from, if there's allergies, intolerances, it might be that the family practices, either the family's deciding they're vegan or the family's gluten-free because that child may not be, but maybe somebody else in the household. And so in the concrete space, how does one talk to their child about somebody else's food choices being different? So, and really starting at a young age to validate differences, so that it doesn't feel like Johnny gets to eat this and Susie, doesn't get to eat that, or that kind of a thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it can be. You can explain that concretely. You can say, because of Sally's food allergies, she's not able to eat that. And that is something that makes her sick, right? So that's really different than saying cake is bad. This is something that's very concrete. If someone has celiac disease, piece of bread is going to make them sick and they can't have that. And so I think that is a fine thing to do, but you've got to be careful how much, you don't want to instill too much fear or anxiety. So if you have a really sensitive kid, to kind of explain that this isn't something we all need to worry about. This is something unique. And if they're really young, I would probably not start with that conversation. I would, if it was in my house and I had one child with celiac disease and the other child not, I would probably just feed the whole family gluten-free to not make a big deal about it. Now, as they got older, we would have to start having those conversations, and be more matter-of-fact about it. I think I do see a lot of anxiety around food allergies, which makes children scared to eat. And so I think it's something that we all have to be mindful about as parents.
That's great. And hi, Candace. She said she's listening in her office. So thank you on that part. We had a question. I think it's a great question. So we're not going to dive into the whole picky eater, but we know that there are individuals who might be perceived as more picky. I'm always like they're selective, or there might be reasons. But one parent has asked me, said, I have one that's really picky and thin, and one that eats everything and is overweight, and I'm struggling for that communication. I understand what she's trying to say. I don't want to she's trying to avoid the situation of saying that the one who is open to eating everything, it shouldn't eat certain things and that whole piece. So let's break it up into two areas. The first one is what to do when you have members in a household, and maybe you are actively worried, concerned, or even wanting to work on a child's weight. And how do you do that in a way that's positive with, as it relates to the other children?
Okay. So I think that's a good question because we're all such different eaters. And, I really believe if you start to look at people's personalities, they really play out in how we approach food. I mean, it plays out in how we approach everything. But if you have someone who loves new situations, loves being around a lot of people, is excited about adventure, typically that person also eats a variety of foods, is excited about trying new foods, likes all different flavors, and is someone who is a little bit more reserved, doesn't love new situations, more needs to kind of ease into a situation. That person typically may be a little bit more selective in their eating or may need to kind of see a food several times or maybe hundreds of times before they decide to eat it. And so I think just like we need to value our kids' personalities in all areas. We need to do it in food. And so I really recommend for families to follow Ellen Satter's division of responsibility and to really offer balanced meals and sit-down snacks. And once you've done that, you've done your jobs of the when and the what. You take a deep breath and you let your child decide how much they're going to eat and what they're going to eat of what you've offered. So you're not going to short order cook for the picky eater or say, you can't have any more of that food if you're worried that someone's eating more than they need. You really have to trust. And then at the end of the day, we're all going to have different bodies. But if a parent is trying to, quote, control someone's weight, the research really shows that that child is going to have an increased risk of eating disorder behaviors, is going to be more likely to eat in the absence of hunger. That's not what we want.
Right.
And to be more likely to sneak eat. So we really want to be careful about any kind of restrictive messages, and just to know that our children's bodies are going to be what they are, and our job is to provide the structure so they can learn to be competent eaters.
It's great. Candace was asking for Ellen Satter's book. So if you can if you can, what we'll do is afterwards, I'll make sure that Anna comes in and provides the link to that book. But Candace, I also want to recommend in the description today, I included a link to Anna has a free guide, and you can grab that guide, and it's also referenced in there. So we should be good.
Awesome.
So I want to move over. We've got about 10 more minutes, and so please, if people have your questions, go ahead and share them. I appreciate that. We've got one or two people who have some personal questions, so we're going to recommend, and thank you. Go ahead. They put them in the DM to me, so we can follow up on that part. But I think one of the overarching is this area of concern around disordered eating and eating disorders. So for a practitioner, for a parent, can you walk us through how you would start to identify signals that perhaps there is disordered eating or even an eating disorder, and what's the pathway forward on that part?
That's a great question. I think the misconception is that there would be a change in weight, and that's not always the case. So that can happen sometimes. I guess to get that one out of the way, it would be if it's a child, if they're veering either above their growth curve quickly or veering down off their growth curve quickly, or at all, then that's a red flag. We always want kids to stay on their growth curve. If a child does not gain weight in a year, that's a red flag, or if really veers off. But kind of a side note, during puberty, kids on average gain about 10 to 15 pounds a year. That's normal growth. Yeah. So when a parent calls me and says, my child's gained 10 pounds in a year, I'm like, well, that's probably what you need to do.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So you'd really have to look at the growth charts. But other behaviors would be if a child, if their eating habits drastically changes. So if all of a sudden you see a child not eating a lot or eating a lot more than they used to, or hiding food, or being scared or anxious around food, or if their behaviors change even not around food, you'd want to kind of wonder what's going on. If they're being more secretive, if there's just an overall change in personality and you're noticing a tie with food, you want to kind of start to ask questions. Eating disorders are secretive. I mean, that's their function. Part of their function is going to be kept as a secret. And so, but if parents can intervene early, we know that the prognosis is better. And so eating disorders are absolutely curable, but we know the sooner you intervene, the quicker someone can get better. And so to kind of look for that change in behavior is probably the biggest thing. Cutting out food groups is a big one. This one is a little bit loaded, but I do worry when a teenager becomes a vegetarian and their family is not a vegetarian. That's not 100%, but I get a lot of calls with that, where that's how the eating disorder started, whether it was well-intentioned or not, but it's a way to control food. It's a way to eat differently than the people around you.
I love that. And for anyone who's dealing with that, so of course you can have a plant-based diet that is totally healthy. And I think the challenge there now as a parent is to remember that it's all the food groups. So what they don't get to do is not choose a food group. I think we actually are in equally of a challenging area these days with, parents who are following a keto plan or parents who are intermittent fasting, to your point of show and tell, what is some of the messaging around that. But yeah, I totally hear you on, kind of what's that, why am I being A, different, and B, how is that being received within the home?
Right,
for sure.
right.
Yeah.
Yep, with you. People absolutely can be plant-based and 100% healthy, and I'm a big fan of that. It's just that what's behind a child making that big change, and to wonder about it.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean there's a disorder, but just to wonder. Another big one I feel like I need to mention is if a girl who has started their period, that their period stops, even if they're an athlete. Because we know that the balance of input and output is not there as far as eating enough to fuel what's going on, puberty, athletics, that type of thing. That's a red flag. I think sometimes we say, oh, they're an athlete, that's what happens,
right.
But it needs to be addressed.
And the thing is, the great thing about flags, or the great thing about something like that happening with the body, is it's a signal. So what it could be is just a signal that your child now with their athletics is not getting the nutrients that the body needs. It could be like they need more iron or they need more fats or whatever. And so, I think it's also a great, with those changes, whether it's an adult or a child, to turn around and say, hey, with those changes, we actually now need to use that as an opportunity to reassess our nutrition and get some help with that part. We're going to conclude on one of my favorite questions. So I got this a couple of times, but it's basically like the cupcakes at school. So the question mark is, I'm doing all this stuff to try to like not, say good food, bad food, whatever, but it's just not good to have cupcakes every day at school, that kind of a thing. So how does, and especially I'm going to focus on this concrete era timing, like sort of before 12, what is the appropriate way for a parent to communicate with the school and maybe perhaps for parents to come together with the school on what's appropriate and what might just be too much? Because we're not saying just let everything continue to happen. Yeah.
Right. So let's just assume that it is a lot or more than, so I think as general society, we're pretty scared of sugar. I think it's okay for kids to have desserts, but I'm not going to even go there right now.
Right.
If a parent is truly concerned, so that's a parent and that's an adult job or problem, and not the kids don't need to worry about it. 5-year-olds need to just play and learn and all that. So that I would say is something to go to the principal about and see if there is a wellness policy in place. And it would be a behind-the-scenes environmental decision that doesn't need to be addressed with the children. There could be an environmental decision that we're going to celebrate kids' birthdays once a month. So we're going to have all the February birthdays. We're going to celebrate it on February 15th, and that's the day we're going to have cupcakes. And that could be, it's an environmental level change that can benefit everyone, but no child has to hear about it, right? It's just done. No one has to hear, oh, those cupcakes. It's just done. And that's how I think we should be addressing child's nutrition, is from an environmental level, not from telling the individual what they're eating is good or bad.
Right. I love that. And I would just add on top and layer with it too. The more that the school can communicate with the parents about what is actually happening, the more it allows the parents to plan for it in a way that doesn't feel like, oh my gosh, you had cupcakes today at school and I was going to take you for ice cream and now this is like we've had a day of, that kind of a thing. And so I think the underlying here is communication. So Anna, thank you so much. I actually, it gets me really excited. I'm going to share this with our school here in Columbus, and I really recommend. This is just a great conversation to actually engage the conversation. So one piece I would say is if you're concerned about some of these things, share it with your school, share it with the principals, with other parents, and some of these resources that Anna has are phenomenal. So such a privilege to have you here today, and please join us on a Wednesday evenings or Friday mid-morning or midday, depending on what coast you're on, for more of these interviews. And if you have any questions for Anna, 1, I highly recommend that you grab that guide. Number 2, you can put them in the comments here. And number 3, of course, you can grab her at lutzandalexander.com or Sunnyside Up Nutritionist. So thanks, everyone, and have an awesome day.
Thank you so much.
Great.